Climate change and infectious diseases. Infectious diseases are diseases that can spread person to person directly or indirectly. Climate is a big factor for this. As we adapt with our environment, so do these diseases, or more commonly known as microbes. There are 3 different types of microbes: bacteria, viruses, and parasites. They all act differently depending on the situation. For example, ectothermic hosts from parasites with environmental transmission stages allow the parasite to act outside of the host. Due to this, there are many different consequences that can come from infectious diseases. To begin, there has been an ongoing dispute between these infectious diseases and vector-borne infections of humans. Vector-borne diseases are from insects and animals that cause one to get sick. Take a mosquito, for example. You can contract malaria from a mosquito bite. In recent studies, the rise of temperature has been proven to positively affect the spread of these diseases, causing them to become stronger and more immune and to spread more. Ecophysiology of host pathogen interactions. In a host pathogen interaction, the infectious disease depends on that host to get all of the nutrients and variables it needs to reproduce and to spread. Diseases such as viruses are not considered living organisms, so they must live off this host pathogen to continue. The rise in temperature has both pros and cons, as it increases the host pathogen's immunity, but it also allows the microbes to replicate and spread faster, ultimately increasing the
The metabolic theory of ecology, or MTE, is an efficient approach to predict host pathogen response to climate change. The idea behind MTE is that metabolic rate is the main biological rate that controls most ecological patterns. And it's an efficient approach because it doesn't require species-specific details in order to make these predictions, and it uses relations between metabolism, temperature, and body size to infer response to climate change. Different ecophysiological approaches need to consider that different species have different responses to temperature changes. Hosts and parasites can also have different sensitivity to temperature based on the developmental stage that they're in. Ultimately, the most ideal approach to predict host pathogen responses to climate change is to combine metabolic and epidemiological models and then apply them on a more specific basis.
Changed interaction relationships.
Continuing with community ecology, biodiversity, and climate change, raising the temperature in the microbial communities will generally help increase the activity of the microbes. Up to a certain temperature, after that temperature is reached, it will start to damage the microbes. With biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity can increase pathogen transmission because it will lessen the amount of exposure of microbes that are beneficial to you and that can fight diseases. Moving on to shifts in behavior, movement, and phenology of hosts and parasites. Phenology is the study of biological events. Going into trends in species migration or migratory species, many are moving to higher elevation and latitude to account for the climate change, and some are not even migrating at all. The phenological changes in pathogenic lifestyles, the timer of vector life could allow certain parasitic organisms like ticks to become synchronous, and also many pathogens are now surviving through the winter and are developing even further. Climate change effects on developmental stages. Some parasites could hatch earlier and now come into contact with other forms of life earlier in stages of development, and plasticity could allow them to respond quicker to environmental change and survive even longer. So plasticity is how you can adapt to the environment around you.
Consequences for conservation and human health. Climate change has already had an impact on species extinctions. This has happened both directly and through simple interactions with an infectious disease. An example of this would be through coral reefs. 1/3 of coral species and ecosystems are threatened by climate warming, infectious disease, and human activities. Another example is the warming of the Arctic. It is experiencing global warming twice as fast as the average, along with human activities causing extreme topography changes. These changes to the Arctic have caused alterations in the dynamics of hosts, parasites, and disease emergence due to climate warming. Species are not able to keep up with these changes and have declining populations due to this global warming. These changes in wildlife health can directly impact the health of indigenous people who depend on wildlife for food and survival. Diarrheal diseases in humans are often linked to heavy rainfall and warmer temperatures. A common example of human infections cause chorea. This often comes about when underdeveloped countries are drinking contaminated water or just by simply eating undercooked seafood. Coastal Vibrio infections are linked to warmer water, plankton blooms, and severe storms. The Vibrio infection actually spread to the Baltic Sea due to all of those conditions increasing. However, it is very difficult to determine the impacts of climate change on human vector-borne diseases. With this, researchers often say that the best indicator of an infection risk is determining social and economic factors such as poverty.
Drivers. Temperature is a known driver that, considering how we need to see how other factors will contribute to disease and climate, we need to take in consideration to humidity, precipitation, and extreme weather changes in order to see how they affect disease in different ecosystems. Models are tied to this experiment to show how climate change can affect infections. In this case, they're trying to pinpoint certain pathogen types to express the way they respond to climate change when contracted or being spread in different organisms. Climate change and disease risk across different systems. Climate change can affect how other ecosystems function. Insects and plants rely on each other for food and pollination. With plants or insects developing disease or immunities can change the relationship that species has with each other. For example, in this case, bees can be less attracted to pollen, resulting in lower pollination rates. Climate change can also express how organisms adapt to diseases when climate change occurs. Climate-disease interactions and their implications on other aspects of climate change. Studying how climate change affects humans in a direct and indirect way and trying to predict these events and climate change is a task being worked on. It is tough to predict when changes in evolution due to climate change is willing to occur due to the unpredictability of pathogens expressing themselves and the outcomes occurring within individual organisms.